This meeting is being recorded.
Well, thanks everyone for being here. As I mentioned in my email, we're going to focus today's session on the Song of Solomon, so we give it its place. But then we'll return to Second Kings, or the end of First Kings and Second Kings next week. We'll group some of that together because our reading moves a little bit more slowly through that material. So to start off, the Song of Songs. To start off by talking about its name, because of course I'll mix them up and call it Song of Songs, Song of Solomon. And so let's talk a bit about where those names come from and how that frames the book as a whole. So the Hebrew title for the book is the Song of Songs, which means something like the greatest of songs. And you might recognize the pattern there, the grammatical pattern from the phrase the Holy of Holies, which is the holiest of places. But the first line in Hebrew says the Song of Songs, which is Solomon's, which is read by most scholars as a statement of attribution. And we can talk more about that later, where the state of that attribution and how we should understand it. But that's where the English, or what's often translated into English as the Song of Solomon comes, especially in the RSV. So it's not completely coming out of left field. It's at least in the first line. It is in the first line of the Hebrew. So that's where. Both the Jewish and the Christian traditions, of course, have this tradition of attribution. And perhaps surprisingly, given the content of this book, the debates surrounding its canonicity or its status as an inspired book were resolved fairly early on. Rabbi Akiva in the 2nd century, for example, declared it to be actually the Holy of Holies among the texts known as the writings. And from then on, it was not further contested, at least within the Jewish canon, and it became one of 5 major scrolls read on major Jewish feast days. So for example, as we discussed several weeks ago, Ecclesiastes was read on the Feast of Booths or Sukkot, and the Song of Songs, perhaps surprisingly for us as Christian readers, was read during Passover. And so let's take a minute just to consider why that's the case. The first is, of course, that Passover takes place in the springtime. And so this poem has a very emphatic springtime setting. It also mentions Pharaoh's chariot, so at least a hint of a narrative link to the story of the Exodus. But perhaps most importantly, the prophetic tradition has long identified the Exodus as well as the ratification of the covenant at Sinai as an act of betrothal between Yahweh and Israel. And this gives rise to one of the oldest interpretations of this text, where the bridegroom represents Yahweh, represents God, and the bride represents Israel or Jerusalem or the people of God, which also, and this can also help us to understand a lot of the architectural imagery that we see, where the bride is often compared in terms explicitly referring to the temple in Jerusalem. And this, like I said, is old, goes all the way back, at least to the 1st century, where Josephus groups this book under the so-called hymns to God, even as the name God itself is never mentioned, or it's potentially mentioned in one place, actually in the verses that I read. But nonetheless, the whole thing was seen as a hymn to God himself. In the Christian tradition, the same basic reading is taken up, but now with Christ as the bridegroom and the church as the bride. And note that this is itself picking up on an old thread of Jewish interpretation, where especially some Aramaic texts translate certain passages as referring to the anointed one or the Messiah, or at least that's what the texts there have. So the Christian tradition is picking up both on this image of Israel as the chosen people, and God as the bridegroom, and then also this thread of explicitly having that refer to the Messiah. And of course, in the person of Christ, these two things come together. And we can see in these layerings of readings, along with, of course, the literal interpretation of the text as a love poem of 2 human lovers united in a covenant bond, and the beautiful nested nature of covenant, with something like a microcosm and a macrocosm, that the human marriage covenant somehow mirrors the national covenant between God and Israel that we see in the story of the Passover, and then the new covenant between Christ and the church. And then where we see, because it's not as obvious to us as modern readers, where we see covenant in this text is in a lot of the language around my beloved is mine and mine is his, adopting that basic covenant formula that we also saw in the book of Ruth. Your people will be my people, your God will be my God. And so I want us to look together at an example from the text where we can see these layers of allusion and interpretation woven really beautifully together. So in these verses from chapter 4, how sweet is your love, my sister, my bride. How much better is your love than wine, and the fragrance of your oils than any spice. Your lips distill nectar, my bride. Honey and milk are under your tongue. The scent of your garments is like the scent of Lebanon. A garden locked is my sister, my bride. A garden locked, a fountain sealed. Your shoots are an orchard of pomegranates with all choicest fruits. A garden fountain, a well of living water, and flowing streams for Lebanon. So I want to draw out just a few aspects of just these few verses connecting to both texts we've read so far, as well as to these broader traditions of interpretation that I just briefly discussed a minute ago. So the first here is this word bride. It's the Hebrew term kala, which means bride or bride-to-be or betrothed. It can also mean daughter-in-law. So sometimes when you read interpretations of this text, they'll pay a lot of close attention on kind of exactly when this relationship is consummated based off of whether you interpret this word as betrothed or as bride, where the wedding has already taken place. And we see a wedding scene in the middle of the text. So you see how the time shifts in this poem, and some of the different readings of this text emerge from the different valences of that word bride, which nonetheless does consistently refer to someone who's already within or just about to be within a marriage covenant. And the term sister here, which can surprise us up and against that word bride, is a term that refers generally to female relatives of the same generation. And by referring to the beloved as a sister, it draws on an ancient Near Eastern poetic tradition. But perhaps most interestingly for our case is the emphasis here that to enter into a covenant relationship is to become family with someone, and that family bond sort of has no limits. And we see that in this text so beautifully. For example, in the one verse where we see the bride wishing that her beloved had suckled at the same breast as an infant, where there's no amount of closeness that is sufficient, that closeness had to go all the way back to infancy, to breastfeeding at her mother's breast. And that's the extent of closeness that we're looking for here, where it kind of breaks the bonds of specific familial roles and of different or specific types of love. It overflows all of these categories in the way that we're invited to see in covenant making in general, the way we see where Israel is differently referred to as a child or as to the bride of God himself. The next thing to point to here is, of course, this honey and milk, which is an obvious reference to the promised land, to which the beloved's mouth is being compared here. And also, this is where we see that the beloved, there's also echoes here of the beloved himself being the God who made that promise. And we also see in this verse this honey and milk, an allusion to Proverbs 5, which again, in a canonical reading, is also attributed to Solomon himself. And in Proverbs 5, it's can be fun to look at. We see the voice of this mother, so it's my son speaking, and the mother of the bride, the mother of the bridegroom, hovers over this text of Proverbs, but also, or more explicitly, but also the Song of Solomon, where we see reference to the bride taking her bridegroom to the mother's house, as opposed to the father's house that we've been tracking, and so many of these other texts. So this figure of the mother who's advising in the matters of relationships and of love. So here we see that in Proverbs 5 too, but with a very different message, where there's this contrast between the loose woman whose lips drip honey, and then the faithful wife who is like a cistern. So there's this contrast here between honey, in this case, oil instead of milk, and the purity of water, but still with this image of the doe. So the same image of the beloved as a deer that we see in the Song of Solomon. So in this text, though, we see that the source of this purifying water and the source of honey and milk come together into the same person, who is the beloved, who is the betrothed. And we also see here, of course, in the phrase, the wells of the living water, we can also think of John 4 and what's meant there. It's not just water, any old water, it's living water, that which can bring life. But we also notice here that the garden is locked. And we can think, and we'll talk more about the garden in a minute, But we also might hear echoes there of John 10 in the sheep, and with Jesus as the sheep gate, that there's this precious thing that is closed off only to be entered by the proper person. In this case, of course, the beloved, but also in the case of the gospel, the good shepherd, who is himself the gate. And then to focus in on the garden imagery more closely, the garden, of course, should bring to mind the Garden of Eden from Genesis 2:3. And so we're taken back with this combination of water, the same woman offering both honey and milk as well as living water, and then returning to the Garden of Eden. So we're back to this idyllic setting where man and woman can admire each other's bodies and their nakedness without shame. And the suggestion here of this text that this is something of what, and we'll talk more about this, how this is taken up in the Christian tradition of interpretation, how this is suggesting that this is what marriage offers, a taste of the paradise that was lost. And of course, in a different sense, what Christ offers the church, the abundant life that we hear in John, or the real life that comes from living water. And it's worth noting here too, that these references to the Gospel of John that come up anytime you're trying to read these texts at all with the Gospels in mind, it's not incidental. It pervades the Gospel as a whole. We see it from the very beginning, or at least from chapter 3, where Jesus is referred to as the bridegroom. But then perhaps most strikingly, we see it in John chapter 20, where there's a long tradition of reading the resurrected Christ's encounter with Mary Magdalene at the tomb in terms of this poem. And also a lot of it's a bit too complicated to get into because it means moving between the Hebrew and the Greek, but a lot of very specific linguistic references that suggest that the writer of the gospel himself had the text of the Song of Solomon in mind as he was composing this text. And therefore also that the tradition of interpreting Christ as the bridegroom in the Song of Songs goes back at least to the writing of the Gospels themselves. So it's worth reading this out loud to get a sense for how these allusions work. So this is from Cyril of Jerusalem. But before he entered through the closed doors, the bridegroom and suitor of souls was sought by those noble and brave women. They came, those blessed ones, to the sepulchre and sought him who had been raised. Mary came seeking him according to the gospel and found him not. And presently she heard from the angels and afterwards saw the Christ. Are then these things also written? He says in the Song of Songs, on my bed I sought him whom my soul loved. At what season? By night on my bed I sought him whom my soul loved. Mary, it says, came while it was not yet dark. On my bed I sought him by night. I sought him and I found him not. And in the Gospels, Mary says, they have taken away my Lord, and I know not where they have laid him. And the angels being then present, cure their want of knowledge, for they said, why seek ye the living among the dead? But she knew not, and in her person the Song of Songs said to the angels, saw ye him whom my soul loved? It was but a little that I passed from them, until I found him whom my soul loved. I held him, it would not let him go. And this is as some interpreters say, like the fascinating context where then Jesus's command to not, for Mary not to touch him. So it seems sort of out of place in the context of the gospel, but here seeing this, potentially its intended referent. And the church continues to hold these two texts together. For example, on the feast of Mary Magdalene in July, this text from the Song of Songs is read as the first reading. And so now let's jump to the end of the song, the chapter 8, the section that I read as part of our opening prayer, to this climactic statement, which is seen as the primary or the summary of the text as a whole. For love is strong as death. We hear here, of course, echoes of Christ's pronouncement of what love to the end is. And this is something that Augustine points out in his letters and his own writing on the Song of Solomon. We also see the song's image of love that goes back even further than the Garden of Eden. This phrase, many waters, which is the same phrase used for the primordial waters of chaos at the very start of Genesis. That love is that which existed or existed from the very start. It was the thing that the waters of chaos even could not flush out from the earth. And so starting here from the garden, from the primordial waters of creation, I want to bring into our shared conversation two last closely interrelated strands, which is the bride as the soul of the believer yearning for God, as we saw in the text from St. Teresa of Avila, and which finds its perfect model or perfect example in the Virgin Mary. So to start this thread of both the soul of the believer as the bride, as well as the Virgin Mary as the penultimate example, or as the ultimate example of the bride. Let's return for a moment to the garden, specifically to the Song of Songs, chapter 7, verse 10. So in this verse, we have the line, "I am my beloved's and his desire is for me." It's interesting that even though this whole poem is built around the theme of desire, the specific word for desire in Hebrew is only used 3 times in the Old Testament and only once in the Song of Songs. But it's used twice in Genesis. And the first one is here, Genesis chapter 3. So this is after they had eaten of the forbidden fruit. This is God in his list of curses says, "To the woman he said, I will greatly multiply your pain and childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children, yet your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you." And so following Scott's Hahn reading of this scene, so we can see here that one of the punishments for the transgression here is a desire for someone who may or may not desire you back, or in this case, actually desires to dominate. So not just potential, so at the very least, a lack of reciprocal affection or the potential for that, at most domination. And here, then we can see this contrast to the Song of Songs, whereas I am my beloved's and his desire is for me, this beautiful mirroring an image of reciprocity. The second case where it's used in Genesis is here, in the scene of Cain and Abel, where the Lord says to Cain, "Why are you angry?" after his sacrifice is deemed less valuable. "Why has your countenance fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must master it." And we know he doesn't. And right after this, he kills his brother Abel. So here, where sin, where this word desire is used to describe sin's desire to prey on man, immediately leading up to this first murder. So again, this contrast with I am my beloved's and his desire is for me, where a love that is strong as death, and actually can, and in the person of Christ, can actually overcome death. And so here is where interpretations that foreground Mary as the bride, I think, are particularly helpful for us. Mary, who undoes the curse of Eve in the garden of the poem, if we take Mary or read Mary as the bride in the Song of Songs, and the garden, which is, again, to use words from chapter 8 of the song, the garden, which is the house of my mother, the very chamber of hers that conceived me. And yet through her desire and her yes to God, it leads her not to sin, but to perfect communion with God. So this great undoing in the scene of the garden where we see this rightly ordered desire that leads to true communion, in communion with that which is ultimate. And so here's where we return to the framework that we introduced in our reading of Ecclesiastes for understanding the wisdom books of Solomon. So in the Greek tradition and now in English translations, the Song of Solomon is placed as the last of the 3 wisdom books of Solomon. Those 3 books are Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Songs. This ordering and attribution, as you may remember from our session on Ecclesiastes, gives rise to a tradition of reading these books as the 3 stages of the spiritual life, with the Song of Songs as the ultimate. So the first stage being the purgative of Proverbs, the second being the illuminative of Ecclesiastes, and the third being the unitive of the song. So the Song of Solomon represents the highest stage of the spiritual life, that one can attain only once one has learned to live wisely in the world from the book of Proverbs, learned contempt of the world from Ecclesiastes, and then is finally ready to learn the love of what is heavenly and enter fully into communion with the only truly desirable thing, which is God. So I'll go ahead and leave it at that, but there's some other fun texts, especially as you can see, this text is read and reread and reinterpreted so much that there's a lot of really interesting readings that I think are edifying for trying to think about how to pray with this text, but we can come back to those maybe in the midst of our discussion. Maybe first, just to open it up to general comments on anything that was raised here, also comments on the experience of reading this text, anything that surprised you, first impressions.
Before I read most of it, I looked it up in the Encyclopedia Britannica just to get an overview, and they mentioned the covenant between Israel and God and Christ and the church, but they said, but most modern scholars just see it as a secular love story. So that's how they end up with their description of it. But I think it's more than a secular love story, and it was very interesting to read the Teresa of Avila's all that it inspired her to write. I just thought, from a very few lines of it, if I don't know if she ever gets through the whole thing, it would take a whole encyclopedia for her at the rate she was going. But very inspiring.
And especially first that she's remarking on the movement that it inspired in her soul, even when it was read to her in Latin, which she didn't understand. Yeah. But even that inspired this great desire and movement towards God.
Mm-hmm.
Any other initial thoughts or impressions from the text or anything raised here?
One of the things that struck me reading at this time was the, I guess it's chapter 5 where, yeah, the looking, like he's at the door and then he's not there, and then it's Brizette looking, and that seems to be in the text of Revelation there, Christ knocking at the door. Yeah, that sense of, for a story that we associate so much with viscerality, that that's all there, but then the moment of consummation is like, wait, he's out of the door, and then there again, she's again like looking for him through the city. So yeah. I don't know, that's something that I think struck me more than any other time I read that.
Yeah, and you get that over and over again, which is this like, flee, go away. It's like it's not. Yeah, especially even the last lines, which is flee, my lover, and be like a deer or like a gazelle on the Spice Mountains. It's like the very last thing is the command to flee. So there's this like, yeah, I think, you see why people reflect on this in the context of the spiritual life, that it's like, you're almost there and then you miss it, or it's like, you can't quite touch it in one's own life.
I'm not sure that this is a fair comparison, but there were parts of the Song of Songs that were reminiscent of John of the Cross and his spirituality and his mysticism and the encounter with Christ being elusive at times. And I remember one poem in particular. I wish I had the chance to reread it before our session tonight, but he's searching in the night, and his lover is difficult to find, and it's in parts it sounds very erotic. It's very it's a love that's quite profound and close. It's not a distant love. It's one that's right there. Anyway.
As you say that, because I haven't read much John of the Cross, but about a month ago, I was reading the beginning of the Ascent of Mount Carmel, and with the first stanza of the spiritual canticle that's a reflection on that. My going outside, I'm reminded of that. So his house had to be all at rest, and then he went outside, and so that sense of like he had to go out of doors. God wasn't just not. It's not like God found him in the fully figured place. It was I'm just reminded of the metaphors of the sort of going back out to the wilderness.
Yeah, did anyone, what was I gonna say? I was gonna respond to you, Mark, about the. Yeah, well, it also what did folks make of the figure of Solomon here? One longstanding reading of this text, well, is that this is a drama. And there's a question as to how many characters are in this drama, depending on how you read it. But of course, one of the challenging figures here is the figure of Solomon, who seems to be both potentially the bridegroom himself, but also the foil, like the thing which is totally against, obviously, with his harem of whatever thousands of women. It's also the kind of opposing figure in this text, especially at the end. So what did folks make of that?
I had never read that. I was just gonna say that I think what you're referring to, that my vineyard, my very own, is for myself. You, O Solomon, may have the 1,000, and the keepers of the fruit 200. So 1,000 referring to a specific verse, which is 1,000 wives. So, that's a very interesting, very explicit juxtaposition.
Yeah.
In the one of the first lines of Teresa of Avila's thing, she says that she thought there was a third person there, and I was going to ask you about that.
Yeah, there's some people read the figure of the shepherd and a figure of Solomon in this text, that there's one thwarted lover who's Solomon, and then this other figure who's the true lover, who is the shepherd. So that's like the reference to the king and the shepherd. That you can read as sort of like a love triangle happening throughout the course of the poem. And that's sort of that's a reading that especially as you read it in this kind of theatrical, dramatic way, people interpret. But I think what Saint Teresa is pointing to there, she talked about the humanity and the divinity of Christ being like the kind of two lovers here who end up merging into one. And so that being the figure of Christ as the shepherd king, that of course we see in David being the shepherd king, but then Christ and God being the ultimate sort of shepherd king, the lowly and the most exalted coming together into the same person. So I think that's what she was getting at in that first paragraph or two, where she talks about the two different figures of the lovers there, that ultimately they become one in Christ.
A particular word that came up for me is the use, a word that translated as jealousy.
Mm-hmm.
If you're in the part you read at the end, love is stronger than death, jealousy is cool as the grave, it's flashes of fire. So it's one of those kind of hyperbolic words that's used in a sense that's, the association isn't positive, it's meant positively here. And I couldn't help thinking about the word, jealousy being used in our First Kings text as well. So anyway,
Exodus is the jealous God.
Yeah. So anyway, it seems like it's like a meditation on a positive or positive / ambivalent view of like what jealousy is in a spousal or relationship.
Yeah, which we also saw. Yeah, which we definitely see in, I think, in the depictions of God as at least insofar as we draw the connections between that and God as a jealous God. I think it has to do with the book of Ecclesiastes and contempt, right? That who were we reading? Or what was I reading? That was the
St. Jerome?
No, the lover. Oh, it's the Father Hugo retreat text, where he keeps going back to that we sent that out a few weeks ago from one of the prayer services from the retreat that Dorothy Day did so many times. He, drawing on the Song of Solomon, makes a lot of references to when you exalt your beloved so highly, it amounts to contempt for anyone other than the beloved. But they're going back to what like Ecclesiastes means by contempt, which is not doubting the goodness of creation, but that love of God should be so great that anything else you meet with contempt compared to love of God.
Mm-hmm.
That I think, yeah, I feel like jealousy is part of that same picture there.
Hmm.
Which doesn't actually, like, it's not actually commenting on the goodness of that which is created, but it's just
Yeah.
commenting on the relative love that even in the face of what love of God should be, even, love for good things should amount to contempt.
Yeah.
As I was reading, I was just fascinated too by the fact that, like, I had not, that current in the Gospel of John, which we just read, that we see here. Like, I just wasn't familiar enough with the Song of Songs to be able to make those connections between these texts. And it's just so vivid, especially like the living water, Christ is the bridegroom, this searching for this kind of elusive figure of Christ. And how, Christ himself is sort of always disappearing. So I found this to have such like a hopeful frame,
Mhm.
or at least for reading the Gospel of John, or at least a helpful reference to have in mind. Had others made those connections before, or did anything look different looking back in light of this reading?
I'm not sure I'm speaking to your point, Emma, but I think back to Charles Peggy, that we read a while back, and he talks about finding God through our bodies, through and I'm not phrasing this the right way, but so much of the Song of Songs is physical reality, and the words direct us toward the most beautiful parts of that physical world that we live in. And I think the suggestion there is that God, the God of all creation, can be found in creation, and the beauty of that creation kind of directs us toward him or her. I found that that's compelling for me, especially when you think of the Last Supper and the Eucharist, the institution of the Eucharist. It's the bread and wine that is the physical reality that will direct us toward eternal life.
Mhm.
Just the thought that came to mind while you were speaking.
Yeah. Mark, what you say, what that brings to mind, if I were to juxtapose, I mean, so like what we have in spades here, as opposed to maybe more normal language for thinking about spiritual realities or theological ones. I mean, I think of the way we use the word love, the truth, and it kind of like a very sort of like an abstraction concretized, whereas here everything is like, so those words, I mean, the word love is used, but entirely filled, not filled in, but taking our imagination, so not sort of drawing on what maybe that would already have for us. Sorry, what I actually wanted to say at the beginning is that I like the basically a critique of idolatry under the name of spiritual materialism, which is funny. I think that when you get really material, not like, oh, the material, God and the world, love, but like the specific things, that it is in a sense you can't be materialistic, even though you're entirely visceral, but then the visceral then is in play with absence itself. And I find that really beautiful. I feel like I'm being taken through the paces that like our more abstract language of God, even if it can express these truths with purity, does so in a way that doesn't take our imagination through the paces.
Yeah, there's a section, I can't find it, but where the beloved is described as, or the bridegroom is described basically as a statue, like a very resplendent statue. And all commentators will note that's like it's like the statue of a god, right? So it's this creating like in words that which like would in reality, at least in this, especially this, would be an idol. But because it's in one's imagination and through those and through the mind, it becomes a way of actually meditating on that which is ultimate because it is absent. So it's like, so the way I was trying to think through the ways like that doesn't work like the golden calf because it's in that creation that actually allows you to access or contemplate the mystery of God, which I think gets at some of what you're saying.
Yeah, if an idol is like where the gaze stops, kind of like your gaze isn't stopping there. It's immediately, it's being used as a way to picture something else, like immediately.
Yeah. Yeah, but you also see the danger of this text, which is one of the things that especially any of the writers in the like early church would write about, that kind of that, or what I read there, what I had on the screen was a quote from Bonaventure again, that this is a text for advanced students, right? Because you can see where all of the hangups might happen, right? Because it is so material and visceral that you see why this is sort of the text for the, it's both the best we can do. It's the highest level of like spiritual development we can attain to. But insofar as it's that, it's also not for beginners.
Mm-hmm.
But one thing along those lines that I don't know that I have up here, but didn't share earlier, is even as it's a text for beginners, I do think it's interesting to think about how in the early church, it was also considered actually the text for beginners, where there is all of these fun homilies that are written for catechumen, for the catechumenate, is that right? For the catechumenate. So people who are just entering the church, where you see, for example, this, where baptism is compared to the bride here taking off her garment. So it's worth reading. Immediately then, upon entering the waters of baptism, you removed your tunics. This was a figure of the stripping of the old man with his deeds. Having stripped, you were naked. And this also imitating Christ, who is naked on the cross. May the soul that has once put off the old self never again put it on, but say with the bride of Christ in the Canticle of Canticles, I put off my garment. How shall I put it on? So that disrobing here is at once participation in Christ's suffering on the cross, or in like the death and suffering on the cross, but it's also at the same time like the bride disrobing for a night of pleasure, right? So it's this that's what baptism is both of these things. And I had heard the one about dying and death on the cross before, but hadn't heard the other. So
could I add something here?
Yeah.
In a sense, this isn't for beginners, because this is actually, I mean, as it says on the screen, mystagogical catechesis. So this isn't pre-baptismal, this is post-baptismal. You entered the bed of baptism. Now I'm telling you what happened.
Yeah.
So the ground, it's funny, I'm reminded of, Catherine and I were talking about the Cyril of Jerusalem, actually, in a conversation. But so actually there's a lot of back work here, like a lot of asceticism and so on. So but it's funny to think, wow, yeah, baptism is like, mystic catechesis post-baptism is supposed to be truly, you aren't a beginner in a sense, like you're in the midst.
I think we missed how different baptism was in those earlier days. I mean, you were massaged with oil. You were disrobed, massaged with oil, dipped in the water, and again oiled, naked. I mean, it was, our understanding is so puritanical that we cannot, I don't even think we can read this book well. I think we have so much weird stuff that has gotten in the way of our embodiment and the way that we perceive desire and sensuality and the body as something which God loves, that it has totally gotten in the way. So in some ways, I agree that it's both for beginners and not for beginners, if that makes any sense. it's not for beginners, not because it shouldn't have been as it was in those early days where we could talk about those things, perhaps a little bit differently, but because we have destroyed the capacity for ourselves to see this kind of, we can't even understand the word desire anymore. We can't, we've lost something of this, because our modern language is deformed in terms of our understanding. And I think, when I look at this, that's what I think about is, when they were massaging a person's body with oil to prepare them for baptism, it didn't have this other element that we would put upon, we already put upon it. And as I'm saying this, I mean, can you imagine that in a modern church? No way. No way at all. I mean, we have lost, and therefore something has been lost.
Yeah.
Something significant has been lost in our understanding of our embodiment.
Yeah.
So that's kind of where as I was reading this, that was what I came across, is like, we've lost something so significant that we don't know what else it's attached to that we've lost.
Yeah.
About the incarnation.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
desire.
And I think it's interesting too, like how, because if you think about the elements here, right? Like I think about, the emphasis here is so much on perfume, and thinking about when well, I guess this isn't always true, but like what we associate with, like high mass, for example, or incense, or the things that have these sensual elements, because of what they're up against, especially, I don't know, cultural context or how we, perceive things in terms of positioning especially along the political spectrum. I don't know, so much. I was just thinking about all the baggage layup. That's really all I'm saying.
Smells and bells is
Yeah.
considered staid, basically,
Yeah,
like ironically.
Yeah, and it's
Because-
not
yeah.
this, it has lost that ability, or we don't allow it to have the ability, or whatever the problem is. There's so much baggage there that we no longer see that as this like rich and sensuous experience that could lead us to contemplate the created world in this way, our bodies in this way, pleasure in this way, in the way that I think you were saying, Leah. So just to comment on, yes.
Yeah, and there's not even, and that's only one part of what used to be the perfumed.
Yeah.
I mean, you were perfumed when you were sick as well.
Mm-hmm.
The oils had fragrance for a reason. It had meaning. The scripture has a lot of language around things which we see maybe as a thing, but in fact was symbolic partly by its scent, by its taste, right? And we don't even know what they are.
Yeah. I think
You know what I mean? I found that very interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm much in agreement, Leah, and I can't help, I mean, that this is sort of repeating something I said a few minutes ago, that I think that some of it has to do with like our sort of conceptual idolatry, that when anything visceral to us, we immediately think, oh, that's a symbol of this thing and of this reality. And the reality we think is actually the same thing as the concept language for it, that's the highest language, the highest understanding is that. And then there are things that are supposed to evoke that. So and that's not saying that the evocation is wrong, but we're wrong when we think we actually have it captured metaphysically, and then there's like that other stuff.
Yeah.
But like, what if, I think the Song of Psalms challenges us and the mystical tradition to say that actually, no, I mean, not that those texts are the real thing, they're not, but they are very obviously, if they're part of the higher stage, that's very interesting that's the higher, because it clearly hasn't left language behind, or non-conceptual language. It's still right there.
Yeah, it reminds me a little bit about debates around iconography, though we probably brought up before, but that in the divide around iconography, and even with its like reintroduction into the church, or reincorporation into the visual language of both the East and West. In the West, it still has the sense of, okay, of religious art, icons are for iconographies for the purpose of teaching, that it points back to a concept, it's the way we teach the illiterate, and versus, an older understanding that now we associate with the East, which is that like the icon's actually a window into the ultimate, that like we actually put chrism on an icon, like that it's actually, there's something, yeah, that is it's a pass through there. It's not something, it's not a bridge to concept or a bridge to something that we can learn as an alternative to a text, but rather it's actually the bridge to something ultimate, and just how different that is. And I think that describes some of the loop that you're talking about. And some of what we miss when we think about, incense as symbol of this or something like that, that we're missing something. And in large part, something experiential. It's something, it is actually what that might spark in the soul.
Yeah.
Well, the other,
That
oh, please, Mary, go ahead.
That reminds me of what St. Teresa of Avila was saying, that because she's writing these things for the nuns that are in her convent that she apparently is the superior of, and she's telling them, you may not understand this, but that's all right. Don't let your intellect get in the way. It's it's teaching you about the soul's love and the soul's desire, and the intellect has to take a second place to that, and don't try too hard to understand it in an intellectual way. Just read it and let it work on you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and in case anyone's taken by these things, here's another excerpt. This is the Eucharist and the kiss of Christ. Which, as Teresa talks about in that text too, the kiss of peace. There's the kiss of love, the kiss of peace, the kiss of friendship. All of these things come together. And I also thought this was interesting because we've been tracking we tracked the kiss in the David story, the kind of that which is the mark of betrayal, at least in Judas, and some of the scenes we have around the David story, and then the real kiss of reconciliation, of peace. So to think also about the Eucharist, and again these very visceral ways along the same lines.
Should we read this, Ellen?
Yeah, sure.
You have come to the altar. The Lord Jesus calls you. For the text speaks of you or of the church, and he says to you, let him kiss me with the kiss of his mouth. You see that you are pure from all sin, since your faults have been blotted out in baptism. This is why he judges you to be worthy of heavenly sacraments and invites you to the heavenly banquet. May he kiss me with the kiss of his mouth. Seeing yourself pure from all sins and worthy to come to the altar of Christ, you see the wonderful sacraments and you say, may he kiss me with the kiss of his mouth. That is, may Christ give me a kiss.
That notion is so intimate. And when I first read may he kiss me with the kiss of his mouth, I immediately understood, may he kiss me on the mouth, because how else would he kiss me he can't kiss me without using his mouth, but if he kisses me on the mouth, he's exchanging a breath with me. And that is an exchange that's so intimate and so close that it's almost like our souls touching.
Mm.
To me, it's a beautiful thought.
Mm-hmm.
Not my thought, that thought.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a specific from the song here, the references to the watchmen. So specifically in this text, but then I'm also reminded in the Psalms and in some of the Psalms, the the Watchman symbol, I've always loved the symbolism of the Watchman, like watching for the dawn. So that idea that, you know, and again, here in this context, for all of its viscerality, that in a sense, we're waiting for the first hint, the first intimation, like just the first glance of the lover, just the beginning of the dawn, that in a sense that we're, I mean, I'm reminded here of like the, you know, the fragrance sort of goes before, but anyway, that I think we're invited into that position too, to be watching and waiting for the first little hint of any of this that is supposed to entirely take us.
Oh yeah, and I remember what I was going to say earlier too, that just one other comment about the Eucharist and desire. Thinking back too to that this is, I was looking, it doesn't seem to be the same Greek word that the Septuagint uses for desire. But yeah, in Luke, where we see, I greatly desired to share this Passover with you. And that's the recent apostolic letter. So Jesus saying to his disciples, I've greatly desired to share this meal with you. And then Pope Francis recently wrote a letter that's about that the Eucharist is this. One of the things we're meant to experience in the Eucharist is God's desire for us in this intimate way. Interestingly, I read the letter. He doesn't quote the Song of Songs, which is surprising, given the nature of it and its roots here. But yeah, that this is something that recently Pope Francis has been writing about. We heard a couple homilies on it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and I was already thinking of the Emmaus story, where people like once Jesus had appeared and then wasn't there, we realized that it was desire that they themselves had felt.
Hearts burning.
Yeah, their hearts burning.
Emma, you could probably speak to this better than anybody else I know. But the Hebrew word I remember reading a long time ago, the Hebrew word for knowledge, yada, Y-A-D-A-H, yada, it's more than just knowledge, it's intimate knowledge of, and I think in the first context in which I read it, it was, it comes with a man's knowledge of woman. There's that dimension to it, and that to me was very revelatory in the sense that when we think of knowledge in our current context, it can be technical knowledge, it can be all sorts of book knowledge or whatever. But when we think of knowledge in that context, it's really an experience of I can't find the word, but something much more magnificent than just anything else.
Yeah. Yeah. The knowledge that comes from, in this case, knowledge of God that comes from communion with God or unity with God. It's beautiful.
But to Leah's point, it comes through our physical union. It comes through our one part of that is a physical union that we come to through our bodies. And I think Leah's right on point that we tend to suppress all that in our modern era.
Yeah. Oh, Catherine's here.
Hello.
She's coming back to the bodily work being done outside.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. I'm just I'm very interested in that, especially what it would mean to know other gods or to know, that being idolatry.
Which was often paired with, explicitly eroticism, temple prostitution.
Yeah, sure. I mean, certainly, it's not my thing, but it's cool to consider then, what is proper for one to know as well, or to be intimately familiar with or acquainted with. Because knowledge in the technical sense also has, when I think of knowledge in the technical sense, you can't get enough of it. But I mean, when we're thinking more in the Hebrew sense that you brought up, like actually, of course, there are some limits to what we should know and not know.
The tree of the knowledge of good and evil.
Yeah,
Yeah.
of course.
Yeah.
I think that's actually that. Yeah, is that, do you think in that specifically the Hebrew formulation there, do you think we're invited to think of like that it's not, oh, knowing what good and evil are, but yeah.
I would
don't
have
know.
to, I would have to look. I don't know what the word is there for knowledge. And I guess I really appreciate you bringing this up, Mark, because I had only thought of it in the reverse, which is the like, this is our euphemism. So to know is sort of like the denial of like a physical union, you know, so it's like, that's why we say to know, but I had never thought about in reverse that then to know is to have this experience of union. So I really appreciate that. I'd only ever thought about it in the like keeping at bay sense, not in the, but I think both are there. So it's really beautiful.
Yeah, I mean, we're with all the connection we're making with John's gospel to here, we can help think about the stages of revelation within particular or coming to know, and the invitation to come and see, to come and Jesus, well, yeah, I mean, yeah, you hear it here, but come and see, and abide where Jesus abides, like where he sort of kind of sits down, takes us where you could abide with Christ, or where he abides with people. That it's these metaphors of intimate presence.
Well, in that union, in that physical union, you are participating in the act of creation, potentially, and that is as close as you may ever get. I don't know, but it is certainly something that is profound for me to think about, because I grew up thinking of sexual union as being something quite different than that until I, got a little mature in my life. So this is something that's to think of procreation as participating in with God, who is all of creation, is a way to experience the eternal, or one way, some way.
Yeah, and I appreciate here too the connection between the bride of the Song of Songs and Mary, because I think Mary often is also the figure that we, that of course, like the virginal mother that we use, that I think, can be sometimes at the heart of the battlegrounds, at least of this sort of discussion, but also I think the thing that we, if you think, Leah, going back to what you were saying about, baptism and like the sensuality of it in a different context, how we lose some of that. I think some of the root of where we lose that is our kind of misreading of Mary. But here, like the invitation to see her as the bride of this song, right, really changes that how you read her as a figure, that it's this great outpouring of love, that it's that like her, it's this great openness and outpouring of love that allows new life to arise in her. That being, of course, Christ and the Son of God. And there's this beautiful section from St. Francis de Sales. I know it's pretty famous because of its striking image of Mary sleeping in the side of Christ, that uses images from the Song of Songs, that she's like the dove. But still, like this is a different image of motherhood, of everything that we're talking about here, starting about halfway down. Well, part of this is reflection on Mary's mission. But then here, what dreams must thy holy mother have had when she slept while her heart watched? Did she not dream that she had thee in her womb, or hanging at her sacred breast and sweetly pressing those virginal lilies? Ah, what sweetness was in this soul. Perhaps she often dreamed that as our Savior had formerly slept at her bosom, as a tender lamb can often upon the soft flank of its mother, so she slept in his pierced side like a white dove in the cave of an assured rock, so that her sleep was wholly like to an ecstasy as regards the spirit. Though as regards the body, it was sweet and grateful and unwearying, and rest. So there, to see these images, all of these images of the Song of Songs come together there. We're thinking about the intimacy of Mary and God, and also of, where you again see the spilling over of love and closeness that spills over. Yeah, it's not just sister or lover or son, or, it's all of these things combined. We're also close to time here too, so we could, have any last comments and talk about next week. Does anyone else have anything they want to chime in with? So next week we will go back to First Kings. We finished up First Kings, so we'll continue our reading of Second Kings for next week. And as I mentioned last week, what we're following, so we have the prophet Elisha in this week's reading, and the next week we'll see the final unraveling of both the northern and southern kingdoms. So marching along in that trajectory. So hopefully this offered somewhat of a welcome break in discussion from those narratives. But we'll go back to that next week.
Very welcome.
Yeah. I thought so, Lynn.
I'm sorry. That's for me particularly.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Well, should we leave it at that?
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you,
Yeah.
everybody.
Thank you
Yeah,
so much.
thanks for the good discussion.
Yeah. Peace.
Good night.
Bye.
Bye.